Aloha, everyone. My name is Chelsea Anasio, and I'm the moderator for this session titled One Step Closer to Addressing the 800-Pound Gorilla, Introducing Hawaii's First Non-Point Source Rules. Please use the Q&A section during the session to ask any questions you may have. At the end of the presentation, we will have a few minutes for the speaker to answer your questions. At this time, I'd like to introduce the speaker for our session. Matt Carano is the head of enforcement for the Hawaii Department of Health Clean Water Branch. You might know him if you have an NPDES permit and have been inspected. If you're in the NPDES game long enough, you guys will probably cross paths. Please help me in welcoming Matt Kurano.
Thanks, Chelsea. I'm just scrolling through everybody's names right now, and I'm super bummed because there's a whole bunch of you that I haven't seen forever, it feels like. And if we were in person, I'm sure we would be talking story outside and everything else. So first of all, thank you for attending. I miss y'all. I wish we could see each other. Hopefully next year is the year, right? And with that, I'll jump into kind of the presentation I have for you. For those of you that do know me, I actually deal a lot better when there's questions and there's material and we can kind of talk off of each other. This talking into a computer and just looking at names is bizarre. So I apologize for that. But with that, please use the chat for questions. Chelsea is like my big partner in this, and she promised me she'll make sure I get the questions and we'll have something of a discussion. But anywho, we'll start. So my name is Matt Kurano. Chelsea gave me a great introduction. I've been here 17 years now at the Clean Water Branch doing NPDES work. I'll start kind of with telling you a little bit of a story. So about 10 years ago, we're doing this inspection and I looked at the permit and I was like, oh, okay, as a young inspector, you kind of you read the permit and you do your inspection and you don't question the basis of any of it and whether any of it makes sense. You just kind of take it as law. But the beauty of enforcement, at least, is you have to see the other person face to face. So when you're doing inspections, for those of you who do inspections, and then for those of you who are on the receiving end of inspections, it's always that uncomfortable discussion. So I was doing this inspection and I finally read it and I was talking to the other person and we got to the limits and they were like, I don't understand these limits. What are these limits for? We're an agricultural facility. I thought agriculture is outside of NPDES. And that actually launched a whole bunch of questions on our side, which ended up non-point source rules 10 years later. So this has been going on a long time. Let me start by asking kind of, let's see, what do you guys think are the worst water pollution sources, that we deal with in our state? I think a lot of people in the NPDES world, wastewater treatment plant operators, construction, MS4 stormwater folks, I think anybody who's in our industry will start saying it's not us anymore. Point sources in the clean water world are heavily regulated. We measure pollutant discharges in micrograms per liter. And I think all of us who do this work for a living, not necessarily the advocacy side, but definitely the ones who do this work for the living in the industry, will be quick to tell you that it's probably not the regulated sources anymore. It's probably everything else. And when do we face these bad water quality times? Well, I can tell you, I'll go swimming anytime it's sunny in almost any beach in Hawaii, streammouth or otherwise. But it's actually after heavy rains and especially heavy periods of sustained rains that we put out brown water advisories. And that I think, again, those of us who are in the know, that's when we stay away from the streammouths. That's when we stay away from the areas that we know are cesspool. That's when we kind of get more concerned about water quality. And it's when it's very, very obvious. Something to just kind of keep note, right? It's like we don't put out brown water advisories except when it's raining. And we average about 100 brown water advisories a year. And again, those of us who know that the water quality is worse than the 100 brown water advisories reflected. The year are more of a proxy for when just the coastal waters are pretty bad. And if it's the coastal waters are really impacted, for certain that the streams are running brown. So what are those sources of pollution? Is that the wastewater treatment plants? Is that the overflowing collection systems? What is that? You know, in my mind anymore, NPDES regulated facilities are still significant potential sources of pollution, but because of all the good work most people honestly in this audience are doing, they tend to be the most uncontrolled and mitigated sources of pollution out there. So really, when is it and what is it? It's agricultural fields. It's the loss of our streams and the condition of our streams. It's watershed level impacts from forestry, from lack of forestry management. At the mouth of streams or harbors, it might be marinas that are causing water quality impacts. These to me are the ones that really stand out in my mind as the biggest sources that compromise water quality for the state of Hawaii. And, you know, I've been known as a cynic, but I do believe that the NPDES program and the point source regulations, and again, I keep coming back to this, all the good work that you guys are all doing, I believe that it has a profound impact on preventing pollution from what we think of as the common sources of pollution, wastewater treatment plants, construction sites, industrial facilities. Yes, there are still problems. Yes, it's a constant effort, but it's well controlled. A lot of good work, a lot of great results. But everything else that falls outside of that domain has been really getting worse. And I'll explain that in a little bit. But there was always a question, for those of you who remember Jerry Takeyasu, he was one of the forefathers of the city's MS4 program. But whenever we would get together, you know, we would ask how the city's doing with their MS4 program. And he'd say, well, we're doing great. What are you guys doing about all the other sources? And that's, again, from 10 years ago and up until very recently been actively working on by the Department of Health. And all of those sources are non-point sources that have culminated in the first set of rules under Chapter 11-56 for non-point source pollution control. And I'll talk about that. So that's been a really big lift. This is a really great accomplishment by a lot of people here. First, just really briefly though, what is a point source versus a non-point source? And this is, I've talked about this last year and I talk about it at different times because the way we learn things, especially those of us who come into this industry, you know, not from the EPA or maybe not from, you know, another environmental, we come in kind of fresh and we're taught this concept of a point source, and this point source is a discrete conveyance, and this point source, we almost get taught that this point source is something real and tangible as opposed to kind of a regulatory distinction. You know, there are sources of pollution, and at the end of the day, if you had all the resources and all the technology in the world, you could find every source of pollution that's out there, and the whole world would be point sources. But in the Clean Water Act, there's a recognition that there's going to be this area, these kind of groups that are not so distinct, that are harder to determine their impact on the actual surface water, as well as groups of exemptions by law that we don't call point sources that are going to need to be managed, but the way we manage them are going to need to be differently. So with point sources, we say, okay, we know that you have a discrete source of pollution. We have an end of pipe concept. That pipe is yours, you can control it, and we have NPDES permits that obligate that. Everything else that we're not certain, or exempt, we're just gonna call it non-point source. So it's really this abstraction of how we draw the line in the sand to say to whom NPDES permits are applicable. Now there's a common misconception then that if no NPDES permit is needed, you're not a pollution source. And that was never the intention in the Clean Water Act. It just meant point source, NPDES permit eligible, anything else, not NPDES permit, but that doesn't mean not a pollution source, nor does that mean that you are free from regulation or free from any type of obligation for pollution control. So I don't read from my slides, right? Some of the slides are just background stuff. You know, for people who are visual learners, they might want to look at this, but this is my summary for what I kind of just talked about. What I do want to highlight though in this concept of point source and non-point source is both of those words or both of those terms are really from the Clean Water Act, which is the federal law. Why non-point source became very important too was because point sources were under federal domain, federal and state domain, but non-point sources, whatever fell in outside of that NPDES category, was intentionally designed to be a state-only obligation for regulation. Now, many different states took a lot of different ways about doing this and have different levels of maturity in their non-point source program, but in Hawaii, we haven't had one, not at all. In fact, Hawaii has a really highly developed point source program. This is just a simple basic kind of flow chart that we look at water pollution from point sources as wastewater or stormwater, and there are overlaps in how we deal with it. But ultimately, it results in NPDES permit that only authorizes certain types of discharges into the streams and oceans, and that's great. But again, what about everything else? Well, it turns out we have legal authority. We had authorization from legislature in the Hawaii Revised Statute 342E, but we never had implementation law, which is what the administrative rules are. That has created a big hole or puka in the regulatory structure. It also created a big puka, not just on the regulation for regulation's sake, but it created a big hole in Hawaii's overall strategy on how we deal with pollution sources or water pollution sources. Again, if you're a water pollution source that is subject to an NPDES permit, well-developed program. You guys are all familiar with the Clean Water Branch. But what if you're exempt? What if you're agriculture? What if you're forestry, that you're really not a point source? How do we deal with that? So in 2021, so this is summer, it's just so odd to me. I don't know about you guys, but this last couple of years is still a blur. But we've been working on these new rules. We went out to public notice. We went to hearing, the whole rule process. And finally, in June, the final rules, which are the first set of non-point source rules, were signed into law. The rules themselves were structured already around Hawaii's general non-point source strategy, which was always a voluntary program that looked at 6 major sources of non-point source pollution: agriculture, forestry, marinas, urban areas, hydromodifications, wetlands, and riparian areas. These 6 categories were like a really important jumping off point for how we're going to address these major sources. And, when we had sat down years ago to start developing these rules, we thought, there was a lot of conversation. Do we create permit programs? Do we not create permit programs? Do we do permit by rules? Do we do permits at all? And then it was, what are the complexities associated with developing a regulatory framework for each of these? So we looked at agriculture, forestry, and marinas first. Agriculture is complicated. There's small farmers, there's big landowners, there's diversified farming. But in agriculture, one of the big drivers or thoughts that we've been thinking about is Hawaii went from the big 5, which we all, some of us that are old enough still know, being primarily monoculture, right? Either sugar or pineapple. But those huge companies, people don't realize, and I didn't, they really did maintain their infrastructure, the agricultural infrastructure, really well, frankly. And they had dedicated resource to maintaining that infrastructure. There's people who don't know, again, I just learned this recently, but that they were called ditchmen, and their job was to maintain the irrigation ditches. They maintained it from a flow point of view, but they also maintained it so that you don't lose soil loss and everything else from it. But with the loss of sugar and pineapple, not a lot of those lands now have been turned over to state agencies. And as I think everybody can acknowledge, government agencies are typically under-resourced and oftentimes don't actually have the institutional knowledge that maybe the private side had. And so some of those, the maintenance or the sophistication with owning and operating those big lands were lost. So when we looked at agriculture, one of the big risk groups that we looked at was frankly government-owned properties, large government-owned properties. And we said, okay, that's one of the first things we're going to have to address. We want to make sure that the state-owned properties themselves, large state-owned properties, weren't major sources of pollution. There's a concept that still the privately owned side didn't lose the same institutional knowledge that perhaps was lost in land transfer over to government agencies. So we chose to take agriculture on it from a technical standpoint. Then forestry, especially in Hawaii, is largely, again, state agencies, DLNR. And we, as directed by our, this went through a couple administrations already, but as directed by our big bosses, there was a very big acknowledgement that we, the collective we, the big bosses, didn't want state agencies to be water pollution problems. And I personally, and I hope everybody else, appreciated that sentiment. So they said, okay, look, forestry is something that it's heavily owned by the DLNR. There's forestry programs, but they're not built around water pollution. So let's create an angle for water pollution so that the forestry programs themselves can start implementing, and they have. And same for marinas. Marinas in Hawaii are primarily from a standpoint of the numbers is state-owned, DOBOR, DLNR DOBOR. Now there are some private marinas as well, but there are definitely public marinas and publicly owned marinas. And the same sentiment from our big management then was like, write rules so that our state agencies aren't water pollution problems. And that's where we went. So the first, we created a body, 1156, of the general framework of how this program would work. And for those of you familiar with the NPDES general permit program, then we have appendices, that Appendix C for construction, Appendix B for industrial facilities, Appendix K for some of the MS4s out there. And in those appendices, those are the specifications or the requirements for the specific type of discharger. So in 1156, we have an 1156 body, and then we also have appendices. And the first three, again, are agriculture, forestry, and marinas. Appendix A, B, and C. Now, the next horizon will be for us to create specifications for urban areas, hydro modifications, and wetlands. Those are going to be very difficult. So kind of what I just talked about was, as of very recently, but you can click on our Clean Water Branch website, or you can just Google Nonpoint source rules from Hawaii, and you will be directed to Chapter 11-56. And then if you look at 11-56, there are three appendices, A, B, and C. Again, A is for agriculture, B is for forestry, and 3 is for marinas. They act almost like a general permit in a sense that it clearly carves out to whom it applies and the requirements for those groups. So now, instead of having a big book on the Nonpoint source side, we've created this framework now that addresses at least industrial scale agriculture, forestry and marinas, non-industrial sources, and ultimately, again, funding, hopefully with funding, some urban area and hydro modification type sources. And that will culminate in like a registry system and a discharge, allowable discharge system that parallels the NPDES program with some very key distinctions, which I'm prepared to talk about today. But there's 200 people right now attending. I'm sure that there's some questions. Rather than end loading it all, I broke the presentation kind of into this front part and then the nitty gritty. I'd love to take a few questions right now. It's, again, bizarre staring into my screen, looking at my own slides. So I'm going to give a couple minutes. Please put up some questions. That would be great.
Hey, Matt, so the first question we have is, what are the impacts of the Maui County Scotus case ruling on NPDES permits and HAR?
Okay, that's a point source question. But I can give a little bit of thought just on it. And the answer right now is, honestly, we don't totally know. Definitely it's going to have an impact. I think the easiest thing to say is it expands the NPDES universe, right? Because it used to be that we have this distinction. If it goes in the ground first, it's non-NPDES, right? If it goes directly to the surface water, it's NPDES. Well, now the Supreme Court ruling seems to have broadened, right? That line is not so clear anymore. So the easiest answer is I think it broadens the NPDES universe. To what extent is not yet answered.
Thank you, Matt. If anyone else has any other questions at this time, please put them in the Q&A section.
Okay, so Chelsea's not bailing me out. So I guess that means I'm going to keep rolling forward with some of the more boring parts of this.
We have one more if you want to answer this real quick.
So I'm not trying to not look at the camera, but Chelsea's in the corner over here. And so I'm trying to look at Chelsea. Go ahead, Chelsea.
Does the marina non-point source include drainage channels?
Drain. I might need a little bit more than that. So yes, it would include any type of drainage channels, but we looked at it from an activity standpoint. So your marina, what are the highest pollution causing activities that might be there? Maybe boat washing is a good example. Certainly boat maintenance, but that would say that the marina operator, so I'll use a good example. When we were developing this, we actually reached out to Dobor, and their administrator, his name is Ed Underwood, great guy. They said, Ed, one of the things we see as a potential pollution source at these facilities are the boat washing or fish cleaning. And we sat around and yes, that is certainly something, right? If I bring back a bunch of fish, ahi or marlin or whatever, and for those of you that fish on the Big Island, this is a real thing, right? And I gut them and I throw it all into the harbor. A couple of things are going to happen. One, that's all waste product. I think we can all agree, right? That's all waste product. And again, environmental regulations are largely about managing your waste. So you shouldn't be disposing of it right in the harbor. It does compromise the water quality in the harbor. Not to mention, if you've ever been to the Kona side, then big tiger sharks tend to just swim around the harbor. But we looked at it from an activity standpoint. So, okay, so if one of the waste streams might be fish waste, then the obligation to the marina should be implementing fish waste receptacles. If the pollution source is something like boat washing, then we need to make sure that the boat washing washing should be maybe prohibited, but certainly rinsing, just like when we rinse off on a beach shower, should be going into an area where that water can actually just repercolate and not go straight back into the ocean and carry pollutants with it. Chelsea looked like she was reading something, so.
Yeah, we have a handful more.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I appreciate that.
All right, the next question is, what is the implication of the non-point source rules on manpower requirements within your agency and on training for those affected by these rules?
Great question, love it. Nobody asked yet why I'd be the guy that's talking about this, because that's a funny one too, right? Because that means I'm not reading your reports. As you guys know, we are really short-staffed. So when some of us were voluntold to work on this, one of the analyses we had to do was how many bodies do you need to take this thing on? And we actually went out to legislature and had done an analysis, and we said, first things first, you need people to actually start implementing a program, writing rules and such. The legislature and their generosity, and I don't mean that flippantly, because times have been really lean, particularly because of the COVID tax collection, but we were granted 6 positions to start a new branch. And the reorganization, again, those of you sitting there in the audience who are part of a government organization, you can feel the pain. Reorganizing took 3 years, but the reorg was just approved 2 months ago. So we are in the process of actually physically figuring out where this new program would sit. And I know my management is in the process of trying to establish positions themselves. So there are 6 new positions, including a branch chief, new environmental people like me, new environmental engineers, a couple of planners. And the first cut will be about 6 new positions. And for a frame of reference, Clean Water Branch for the NPDES program is about 30 positions. So that's, for the NPDES side itself, permitting and enforcement, it's about 15. For our monitoring programs and such, it comes out to about 30, but for the NPDES themselves, it's 15 positions. So 6 positions is significant. And then depending on the universe and the effectiveness of the program, of course, the department could go back to the legislature and request for more, or legislature could cut positions. So that's always a possibility. So that's the manpower. So 6. The second part of it is because it's entirely new regulation, the approach, once there's people to do it, is to inform those who are impacted by the regulation, and many already have, like I said, some of the government agencies. And then if you recall, for those of you in the MS4 world, the first 5 years is really outreach and training and expectations. And I think, like all of us who were in the stormwater program in the late 90s and early 2000s, there's really going to be a lot of learning together of what the best effective practices really are to stem these pollution sources. The department really has taken this position that, especially with these first 3 sectors, agriculture, forestry, and marinas, that the core competency is actually going to be on the regulated side. Forestry and marinas is a really good example, right? That's DLNR, DOFA, and DOBOR. Once we have an agreement that we want to stop pollution and what the angle is, the manner in which it gets done is really best determined by that side. And agriculture, I really feel strongly is the same way. Again, I'm the great apologist, but everyone I've spoken to who are potentially impacted by this regulation have been actually very supportive, which is a great thing, because nobody in Hawaii, and I've said this before, nobody in Hawaii wants to be the environmental villain. This community is too small, and we all care far too much about it to really not care, and it's always not tempered, right, with how much is it going to cost, what am I going to have to do? But if we look at something like agriculture, they don't want to waste fertilizer. They don't want to lose dirt. They don't want to waste water. Those are cost items for them, right? And sustainability items. From an environmental standpoint, we don't want them to dispose of excess fertilizer. We don't want them to lose the dirt, and we don't want them to waste the water. So it's really complementary goals. The way in which we go about it, I think, is going to be a big question. So first 5 years, I think, I shouldn't say 5, we don't know how long, but definitely as we roll the program out, there's a commitment by the DOH to be doing a lot of the training and to be doing a lot of compliance assistance. What's a little bit different is the way that the new branch was even structured, is there is a dedicated compliance assistance side of it. Now that's very different, right? For those of you familiar with the clean water branch, there's the permit and there's the enforcement, and everything else is on you. This new program recognized that there are manpower resources needed for support, community outreach, and compliance assistance. And I think that it makes sense. And, even in my time at the NPDS side, we actually spent a lot of time on compliance assistance. It's shrouded under kind of permitting and enforcement, but the reality is, again, our community, I really believe, responds when things make sense, and it responds to just knowing. And so we're committed to make that happen. Chelsea, we can keep going with questions, because the other stuff I have is about, like, this is how you would register. And this is, and I don't think that that's super exciting for most people, but questions that appeal to people, I think that's a lot better.
Okay, sounds good. We'll keep going then. So the next question is, what would be riparian areas? So I think that's a follow-up from the previous question.
So whoever's writing that question, they saw the real tough parts. So urban areas, hydro modifications, and wetlands, we have not taken that on yet. But the way I see it, if I am so lucky to be a part of this, development of the rules, I really see those 3 as the next era water pollution issues for Hawaii, and frankly, everybody. It's a sustainability. It's preserving riparian areas that may have already existed, particularly when the population was a little bit less. So that would be corridors through streams. I think heavily on things like unmodified streams, which there are not that many left, but maybe on the neighbor islands. Hydro modifications to me is a huge, what could that mean? I know we haven't written it yet, but some of the things we have discussed about them is we certainly know that some of the drainage practices have a major negative impact on water quality and ecosystem health, whether that's just cementing things. And I see some of the names again on this list, and I know you're cringing. You're like, no, I want to cement it. It's easier. It'll last for 100 years. You know, it's finding a balance that when we need to modify our streams or drainage systems to accommodate the growth that exists, we can't turn our back and say, no, back to the natural environment and just let it happen. But we probably shouldn't be so wed to not rebuilding better in a more sustainable way so that the streams don't heat. I always think about it. There's a stream right by my house and I keep meaning to take a photo of it. And you run across a bridge and you look downstream and it's a trapezoidally lined concrete drainage channel. And then you look upstream from this bridge and it's basically native stream, boulders, overhangs, everything else. Now, the amount of water that flows down that stream and on that bridge is the same, right? And they have to accommodate that. So there's in the upper stream areas, I know that there's setbacks. And the downstream areas, to limit the setbacks, they deepened it and hardened it. But we know that as water flows down, it goes from being cool and having, you know, a total kind of healthy ecology to heating up and pH going up, and it dramatically impacts the downstream area, which then leads to impacts to the estuarine area, which then leads to impacts to the coastal area, also including the transport of things like sediment. From a maintenance perspective, you know, there are things that we're going to have to think about, but I definitely think hydro modifications in stream systems is going to be a big thing. I worry about shorelines a lot. Those are especially with surf season, and as you guys all know, the huge tides we've been having. But you know, the 4.1 process, or the WQC, for those again are familiar with that, some of people's frustrations, I think, with it is that the requirements in the 4.1 process, even if they're supposed to be long looking, it seemed like the implementation was very much like a construction permit. And I think that this is an opportunity to create standards and specifications that really look into the future, so that as things are built today, they're not built with 1950 technology. They're built with state-of-the-art technology from an ecological standpoint, water quality standpoint. Sorry, it's a really long-winded answer for that, but that was a really, I think agriculture, forestry, and marinas are really important. But I think the long-term potential impacts for urban area requirements, hydro modifications, and wetlands, I really do think that, particularly for the people that are younger than me, it's funny for me to say that now, because everybody always keeps, you know, they assume that I'm still fresh-faced and excited about everything, which means it's a euphemism for saying young. But now that I have high school age kids and I'm, you know, getting older, like, I think of it as those are the things that all the next gen guys are really going to dive into. We solved, I like to think, a lot of the point source problems. But I think a lot of these lasting kind of sustainability, which comes to really environmental kind of, I think those, we've created a place for it. What actually gets put in there is going to be heavily dependent on the next generation of career folks.
Thank you, Matt. The next question is, does Cesara have enforcement duties, i.e. investigation and fines?
Cesara to itself doesn't. Okay, so Cesara was a federal law kind of paralleling the Clean Water Act, but for non-point sources. And what the Clean Water Act did was it established enforcement authority fines and penalties in the 300 section for point sources. Cesara said states, you need to do stuff. And like we said, non-point sources are the domain of the state. So the question is, did you guys in the state develop a system of enforcement and fines? And the answer, of course, yes. Now, instead of $25,000 per day per violation, it's capped at $10,000 per day per violation by statute. But for the first time, for people who don't comply with whatever the requirement and the legal obligation, they may be subject to implementation of enforcement actions. And I think, again, for everybody that, you know, like some of the people I recognize because we work so much together, but we like to call it the bad actor provision. Fines are really, in what we do, such a small part of what we do, but they're such a necessity for those who wouldn't otherwise cooperate.
Thank you. All right, our next question is, how does this new non-point source regulation impact Native Hawaiian historical site restoration projects?
That is not something that we've thought about, but I know our general always mission would be to make them work together. Good regulation. And so one of the directions that we're given, while we're developing this was through actually 3 different directors, and each one, their guiding principles was it needs to be workable. It cannot be overly zealous, which people think we like to be, but that's not the case. But the third thing is, it needs to work in tandem with the existing regulations. So in fact, some of the nuance of it is they actually work in tandem with things like soil conservation plans. So while I don't think that there's necessarily a direct tie-in with restoration projects per se, I can't envision, at least how they're written right now, that they would prevent or confound, projects that have such a positive benefit.
Thank you. So the next question is, what are the most challenging requirements of the new NPS rules for owners, designers, and contractors? Please address each stakeholder listed.
I think the most difficult requirement is actually formalizing a lot of the practices that may already be implemented. And let me give you examples. For agriculture, a lot of really good agricultural facilities already have a soil conservation plan. And then when we went out and we talked to people who implement, they have clear protocols in the way that they do things to, again, limit soil loss, limit fertilizer waste, limit water waste. What changes is that they've never had to formalize those processes before in some kind of a plan. And the non-point source rules take a lot of best practices from the stormwater rules. And one of the things that the stormwater program does is it says, hey, you really need to craft a plan and you got to train your people to implement the plan. So there's two sets of learning there, right? The designers have to learn what needs to go in the plan, right? And we all recall the learning curve with that. I think we're all a lot better at it now. The second level of understanding is then that the people doing it need to know that it's not just a plan that goes on a shelf, but it's actually best practices to be implemented on a daily basis. So I think that's going to be the most challenging part, is this formalization of a lot of kind of practices. Now we're going to try to real hard to facilitate that with things like templates once we actually have personnel. And I say we because it's not me, it's once this new branch gets set up, I think that's part of the plan. But I think that is going to be the most challenging part. With forestry and marinas, I don't think it's going to be as difficult. The reason why is because the forestry already has, DOFA has a really good program. And a lot of the places where DOFA's efforts overlapped with any kind of pollution control, then the rules actually yield to DOFA's and says, if you're meeting DOFA's requirements because they achieve the same thing, then that's a totally acceptable practice, no further needed on our part. And we try to do that really quite a bit. Marinas might get a little bit more difficult for people too, because now in marinas, like I used the example of the fish waste, we did identify certain practices which we believe have a negative impact. Fish waste being a really easy one. I was lucky enough to go to Alaska and go fishing, and actually their cleaning stations all in their harbor, they have dedicated fish waste cleaning receptacles. And that has actually always been a process in Hawaii that was encouraged, but it wasn't obligated. So now for people like the Land and Natural Resources, DOBOR, I think they're going to have to commit some level of resource to ensuring that they have fish collection areas where they know that there's a lot of harbor usage and fish cleaning. And then, that is an added cost for those agencies. But it certainly, I think, is consistent with kind of other waste practices too. So I hope that answered those questions.
Thank you, Matt. The next question is, how will the new rules be enforced, fines, field citations, and when do you think that will happen?
Okay, that's a really good question. Well, everybody's worried about the enforcement side. I'm worried about them hiring people. We are not the fastest, right? You guys, right? We're not the fastest on anything. When it comes to enforcement, it could happen from day one, of course, right? The legal authority is there. However, I know in a lot of discussions with management, kind of like the approach taken with the MS4s, which it's going to probably be years before you see enforcement in the manner in which you're familiar with it in our enforcement, which is field citations, no votes, civil actions, consent decrees. There is a recognized learning curve that is going to be needed. That said, right, the department always reserves its right because there are times that you come across situations in which someone is really, it's not because they don't know, it's not because they can't, it's because they choose to not. And if that is causing a problem that jeopardizes human or environmental health, and we absolutely have a mandate and an obligation to address that, to not let that continue. But to the frank answer, what's the horizon? My guess is years. My guess is years. You have to hire people first. You got to get those people up to speed. You have to do your field work. You have to develop the processes, policies, and guidelines before you truly have something defensible. So my guess is years.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt. I think we still have time for a few more questions. Any other questions that we're not able to get to at this time, you can definitely, they'll be forwarded to Matt and he can answer them for you. So the next one is going to be a two-part question. What are Nonpoint non-industrial sources, and why is industrial scale agriculture considered non-industrial?
So this was a shorthand. So industrial scale, okay, so first of all, in general, okay, the NPDES program, if you look at it, especially the NPDES stormwater program, is the industrial stormwater program. And industrial doesn't necessarily mean all businesses, right? There's commercial businesses, there's retail businesses. Something like a marina and or forestry management, I think everybody can agree is not industrial. But the reason why we made that distinction, at least for the sake of this slide, the rules don't represent this, but for the slide, is to point out that point sources are really used to deal with industrial sources. So non-point sources are everything outside of that. Doesn't, again, mean it's free from regulation. If they're pollution generating and not a point source, then these rules can capture it. And so that's like, for example, forestries and marinas. Now, industrial scale agriculture, okay, that's a good question. Now, industrial scale agriculture, though, does have two different components to it, right? There's the farming component, right? That's the fields. And then there's the processing component, which is oftentimes the production facilities, which are significant industrial facilities. When you have a production facility, a manufacturing facility, that type of facility, those can be captured as point sources. But if you have the farming side of it, which has historically always been considered an exempt source, it's by definition a non-point source. But what about all the fields? That is why that scale, why we call it industrial scale, is because the rules were not meant to capture the small scale farmer who's subleasing just a small corner of a property. One, they're not that high of a pollution risk. Secondly, then there's the resource issue to doing it, right? Both the resource of that particular farmer, but also the resource of the agency. So because this was new regulation, we wanted to go after the ones with the highest risk of significant discharges. And so we used the word industrial scale because that implied large footprint. So it's not meant to be a misnomer. It's more just to kind of capture the sense of prioritization or scale.
All right, it looks like we're pretty much at time. So thank you again, Matt. That now concludes this session. Thank you for attending, everyone. The next session will begin at 1 p.m. The vendors will be around during the break if you would like to chat with them. If you have experienced any technical issues and need assistance, please visit the info desk to chat with the representative, and we will see you after lunch. And then just the final word is any questions we didn't ask, I'll have Matt get those and he can answer them for you.
So Chelsea will be, I'm hearing Chelsea volunteering to help on our part. Thank you, everybody. Hope to see you next year. Really excited about these non-point source rules. It's going to take a while to get there, but thanks again, everybody. It's nice, though odd, not seeing everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Matt.